Today we're going to be looking at the receiving module section of FTx POS. When we log in, we're going to click on point of sale and then inventory. Under inventory, we have reorder, which is where we will set up our reorders. Then we have receiving, which is where we are going to put our invoices. We want to click into receiving, and under receiving, we have the Invoices tab, which is where we're going to see our active invoices as well as our applied invoices. The invoice number is on the left side, the location that it's for is on the top, and also the vendor that it's from, the total cost of the invoice, and whether or not it's the purchase order attached to it. When it's applicable, if this invoice was applied, there will be a little green circle right here. If it was verified, after it's applied, a manager goes in to verify that everything was there and that it was verified by another manager. There will be a small little green circle on the bottom here. Next to that is going to be the invoice date. If this invoice was applied, it'll have the date that it was applied located here. On the right side, we have modify, which will allow us to open up the invoice and either add or remove items from it. We can also hit delete if we need to completely wipe out the invoice. If we make a mistake to the invoice number and don't realize it until the last moment, we can simply delete it and redo the invoice. The next button is print invoice if you need to very quickly print the invoice out, as well as the button for copy invoice. The second tab is verified invoices. When we're receiving, we can either receive the invoice, apply it, and then move on, or we can add additional verification where a person with higher permissions would come in behind the person who applied the invoice. Then we could reopen it to scan everything just to verify that everything that was on that applied invoice is truly what was received. After that verification phase, once it's applied, that invoice is finished. If there are any invoices that were verified using this process, those invoices will show under the Verified Invoices tab, and we'll be able to view the employee who verified the invoice. For example, if it was verified and the quantity on hand are incorrect, then you would probably want to look at that verified invoice and find out who looked at this invoice and said, yes, we have all these items. We would be able to do that under this tab in between invoices and verified invoices. When we open up the invoice itself, there is a section for notes right up here at the top. This is not a required field, so if we leave it blank whenever doing an invoice, we're not going to get an error. If we need to add any notes for whatever reason, you can do so here. Additionally, we can choose to have a two-step invoice verification during the verification side of processing an invoice, if there was an item that needs to be adjusted. The invoice might say, hey, you sent 3, but they actually sent you 2, and we'll need to adjust the inventory accordingly. When we make that adjustment, we're going to scan the product and type in the number. Whichever method we use, the scan is going to pull it up and ask, how much did you actually receive? When we put in that number and it does not match the invoice, it's going to say, hey, we're going to adjust this and reduce the quantity that you received. Would you like to add any additional notes for why this is being adjusted? On that screen, we're also able to add notes. Between the verified invoice and then adjusting out quantities that the original invoice said that you were supposed to receive, we'll be prompted with sections to add notes explaining what was happening. The next tab is EDI import. Once we have that information set up, this is where we can go to process invoices. If we were to make an order and have EDI info set up, the vendor receives it, processes it, and then they send us back a pallet of merchandise, and then they also send the EDI invoice back. More than likely, we'll get a notification saying that the vendor is delivering our invoices. This will indicate we want to go to Control Center, go to the EDI Import tab, select the location that's supposed to receive that invoice today, and then select the vendor that it's coming from. After we have these parameters selected, we can search invoices, which will look at the FTP server and connection for this vendor that you've set up. When you click Search Invoices, it's going to look at the EDI FTP connection that you set up with that vendor. Log into that FTP, and then check whether or not there are any invoices. If there are any invoices, they're going to show up in a list in the EDI Files to Process column right here. There'll be separate line items that you'll be able to click and highlight. Once we click on it, it's going to give you a preview of that invoice, including the number, location, and a handful of the products that it can see at the top of the file. If it starts to look correct, we can click the invoice number box down here, type in the invoice number, select the invoice date, and then click the Process Invoice button. After that, it'll take the EDI file, convert it straight to an invoice, along with all the items that were supposed to be on that invoice, so items don't have to be manually added. To verify it, we'll scroll through and make sure that the quantities are correct, and we won't have to type in any numbers and manually added items to the invoice unless there is a product on the pallet that wasn't on the invoice. The next tab is Invoice Export. For accounting purposes, this allows us to export all of the invoices between this date range that are configured here, so we can also print out invoices for specific stores or all of them. Or if we have a location group set up, we can print it out by location group and select the vendor that we need all of that invoice data from. For example, if we need to know the totals of all the invoices from a certain vendor for this entire week, we can export those out now. Next is Invoice Excise Tax Rules. This is a way for us to configure a set of rules for applying excise tax to items upon receiving them. When we create a rule and give it a name, we can select which vendor the rule was for. After that, we're going to select the location on Manage Assignment. On the right side, we're going to click the drop-down by locations. Click the green button to move it over, and then hit Apply. After that, we have Manage Departments. This is where we designate the departments that we want this rule to apply to. An example could be your imported beer, as shown here. If we wanted to add a percentage or a flat rate, we could add it here. Once this is applied, whenever we receive products from this department here, it's going to create this excise tax rule where it will apply that value to those items for this department. We can also set up excise tax on individual items. This concludes today's training on receiving.